Commander James Mitchell had been staring at the same set of security monitors for almost 18 hours straight. His eyes burned, his coffee had gone cold somewhere around hour 12, and the fluorescent lights of the Imperial Station's observation deck were starting to make his head throb. But he couldn't look away. Not now. Not when everything was falling apart. 3 dragon hatchlings. 3 small, impossibly valuable creatures that had simply vanished into thin air like ghosts. The Valerian Empire, a civilization that had conquered star systems and bent entire worlds to their will, couldn't find 3 baby dragons. It was almost funny if it wasn't so catastrophic. The Royal Conservatory on Salith Prime was supposed to be the most secure facility in the known universe. It had triple-layered security systems, guards stationed at every entrance, and monitoring equipment that could detect a single hair falling from the sky. Yet somehow, on the night of the new moon, 3 dragon hatchlings had walked out, or been taken out, and nobody had noticed until morning roll call. James had been working as a salvage inspector for the Valerian military for 3 years. He was human, which already made him an outsider in their world, but he was good at his job. He understood machinery, systems, logistics. He could find patterns where others saw only chaos. That's why they'd brought him in to help with the conservatory's equipment maintenance 2 weeks ago. That's also why he was currently the prime suspect in the biggest crime the Empire had seen in a century. The worst part? He'd been in the conservatory that night. Not because he'd stolen anything, but because a water filtration system had malfunctioned, and he was the only human tech available who could fix it without calling in a full repair crew at midnight. Bad timing. Terrible timing. Catastrophically bad timing. Now there was a target on his back, and everyone from here to the outer colonies knew it. The real story, though, the one that made James's stomach twist into knots, was what had been happening to the hatchlings for weeks before they disappeared. They'd been restless. Agitated. Dangerous even. The handlers had reported that the young dragons weren't eating properly, weren't sleeping, kept making strange vocalizations that none of the Valerian experts could interpret. It was like the creatures were looking for something. Searching for something they couldn't find. The Valerian solution, of course, had been typical of their approach. Throw medication at it. Tranquilizers. Sedatives. Mood stabilizers developed in laboratories by scientists who'd never actually spent time with living dragons. Nothing worked. If anything, the drugs made things worse. The hatchlings became more agitated, more desperate, thrashing against the containment fields like they were trying to break free from invisible chains. Then one morning the containment fields were still active, the locks were still sealed, but the dragons were gone. Simply not there anymore. Security reviewed every second of footage and found nothing. No one entering. No one leaving with cargo. Nothing. It was as if the hatchlings had simply decided they were done waiting and vanished. James now sat in a detention cell, listening to the guards pace back and forth outside his door, arguing about search patterns. They were discussing deployment zones, checking surveillance from surrounding sectors, organizing teams to search the major cities and trade stations. All of it felt like they were swinging a club in the dark, hoping to hit something valuable by accident. He knew they were looking in all the wrong places. It wasn't something he could prove, not yet anyway. It was more of a feeling, a gut instinct that came from years of working with systems and understanding how things actually moved through the universe. The hatchlings hadn't been stolen by someone who wanted to keep them locked up somewhere visible. They weren't in any of the obvious locations. The search teams wouldn't find them on Salith Prime, or in any of the major trading hubs, or in any of the places where stolen goods usually ended up. Because these weren't stolen creatures in the traditional sense. These were animals, intelligent, powerful animals, that had been searching for something, and when they couldn't find it where they'd been kept, they'd gone looking. They'd left to find whatever it was their instincts were screaming at them to locate. James lay on the hard cot in his cell, staring at the ceiling, his mind working through possibilities. The Valorians would never understand this. They saw dragons as property, as weapons, as assets to be controlled and managed. They didn't see them as living beings with their own wants, their own drives, their own mysterious purposes. But James did. And that difference in perspective might be the only thing that could save him now, or condemn him further. The interrogation room smelled like recycled air and fear. James sat across from Keeper Vex, a towering Valerian official with scales that shimmered like polished metal and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. There were 3 other guards standing against the walls, their hands resting casually on weapons that probably could disintegrate a human body in seconds. James had been in custody for 4 days. 4 days of the same questions asked different ways. Where did you go? Who did you meet? What did you steal? How did you get the dragons out? He'd answered honestly every single time, and it hadn't mattered. Nobody believed him because, in their minds, humans were incapable of masterminding a theft this elaborate. It had to be him. It had to be some kind of conspiracy. "I can help," James said, leaning forward slightly. His voice was steady, even though his heart was hammering in his chest. "But you have to actually listen to what I'm telling you. Dragons don't hide because they're taken. They hide because they're seeking." Keeper Vex's expression didn't change. His scaled face remained perfectly still, but there was something in his eyes, a flash of irritation maybe, or just pure dismissal. "You understand nothing of dragon psychology, human. We have studied these creatures for 10,000 years. You have studied them for what? 3 weeks? Your theories are the desperate grasping of a thief trying to save his own skin." "I'm not a thief," James said quietly. "That remains to be seen." The interrogation ended the same way it always did, with Vex standing up, his tail swishing behind him and leaving the room without another word. The guards escorted James back to his cell. But something was changing outside those walls. James could feel it in the tension of the guards, hear it in their whispered conversations that echoed through the detention block. The search efforts were failing. Every day that passed, the dragons remained unfound. The pressure was building. The Valerian Empire didn't accept failure, and right now they were failing spectacularly. On the 7th day of his captivity, everything shifted. A different guard came to his cell, this one younger, less rigid than the others. "Come with me," the guard said. "They want to see you." James was taken to a conference room instead of the interrogation chamber. That alone was a good sign. Keeper Vex was there along with several other high-ranking officials. And standing off to one side, arms crossed, was a woman in military dress uniform. Human woman. Dark hair pulled back tight, sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything about James in a single glance. Captain Lisa Torres, according to the insignia on her uniform. "We have an offer," one of the officials said, a smaller Valerian with intricate patterns etched across his scales. "Help us locate the hatchlings and we will consider leniency regarding your charges. Fail or attempt deception, and you will face execution for conspiracy and theft." It wasn't really an offer. It was desperation dressed up in official language. James agreed immediately. Captain Torres was assigned as his handler. She didn't trust him, that much was obvious from the way she watched his every movement, the way her hands stayed near her weapon whenever they were alone together. But she had her orders and she followed orders the way water follows gravity. It was simply the nature of things. Together they began tracing patterns. The hatchlings had been spotted on thermal imaging in 3 different sectors over the past week. The sightings made no sense at first. The creatures seemed to be moving randomly, doubling back on themselves, taking inefficient routes through populated areas. But James kept looking, kept studying the data, kept asking questions that Torres initially seemed annoyed by. Why would they go that direction if they were just running scared? James asked, studying a holographic map in Torres's mobile command unit. "They're animals," Torres said. "Animals don't think logically." "These aren't simple animals," James replied. "They're intelligent. They were acting strange before they disappeared. They were looking for something. What if they're still looking?" Torres didn't respond, but James noticed she didn't dismiss the theory outright. She started pulling up more data, cross-referencing the sighting locations with geological surveys, historical records, anything that might show what was in those areas. That's when the pattern became clear. The hatchlings weren't moving randomly. They were converging. 3 separate thermal signatures, all traveling from different directions, but all heading toward the same location. A place called Sector 7, an old industrial district on the outskirts of the capital city. It had been abandoned for decades, ever since the manufacturing plants had been relocated to orbital stations. Nobody went there anymore. Nobody had a reason to. "They're headed somewhere specific," James said, pointing at the map. "Something's pulling them in that direction." Torres studied the data for a long moment. Then she stood up. "We move immediately. Full team. We don't know what we're walking into." As they prepared the expedition, arming themselves with weapons and scanning equipment, James felt a strange certainty settle over him. They were close. After 7 days of being hunted like a criminal, of sitting in a cell wondering if his life was about to end, they were finally getting close to the truth. And he had a feeling that truth was going to change everything. The warehouse loomed against the twilight sky like the skeleton of something that had died a long time ago. James stood at the edge of the industrial sector, watching the old structure through binoculars. Its walls were cracked and weathered, its windows dark and hollow. Captain Torres had positioned her team in a perimeter around the building, but James had asked for a few minutes alone. Just to scout. just to get a feeling for the place before the military came in with full force and potentially spooked whatever was inside. Torres hadn't been happy about it, but she'd agreed, mostly because James had proven his instincts right so far. He moved quietly toward the warehouse entrance, his scanner in one hand. The thermal readings were clear, 3 large heat signatures clustered together in the lower levels, along with something else. Something massive. Something that shouldn't exist. The warehouse door hung open, rusted hinges creaking slightly in the wind. James slipped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The air was stale, thick with dust and the smell of things that had been sealed away for too long. His footsteps echoed against concrete floors as he made his way deeper into the structure. There were signs everywhere that this place had once been important. Old equipment lined the walls, machinery whose purpose James couldn't even guess at. There were tanks, some still filled with strange liquids that glowed faintly in the darkness. There were workstations covered in the residue of abandoned research. Whatever had happened here, it had happened a very long time ago. He descended a metal staircase that groaned under his weight. The lower level was colder, more controlled. His breath became visible in the air as he walked deeper. And then he heard it, a sound so soft it was almost not there. A rhythmic humming. The sound of life support systems still functioning after decades of neglect. James rounded a corner and stopped dead. 3 dragon hatchlings lay curled together on top of something that made his brain struggle to process what he was seeing. They were sleeping peacefully, their scales rising and falling with synchronized breath. Their colors were softer than any dragon he'd ever seen, almost luminescent in the dim emergency lighting. And beneath them, its massive form creating a bed of muscle and crystalline skin, was a being that shouldn't exist. It was massive, easily 20 meters long, with a body that seemed to be made of something between metal and organic material. Its skin shimmered with colors that didn't quite exist in the normal spectrum. Patterns flowed across its surface like living code. Its chest rose and fell slowly, rhythmically, and the dragon hatchlings moved with each breath, nestled against the warmth like infants. James's scanner started beeping frantically, but he silenced it immediately. He didn't want anything to disturb this moment. The being's eyes were closed, but James could see them moving beneath translucent eyelids. It was dreaming. Or maybe just existing in some state between consciousness and sleep that human minds weren't equipped to understand. But as he watched, those massive eyes opened slowly. They were gold. Ancient tired gold. The creature looked at James, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not words. Not communication in any conventional sense. But something. An acknowledgement. A question. A sadness so profound that James felt it like a physical weight. The hatchlings stirred slightly, their heads lifting. They made sounds, not aggressive, not alarmed. Recognition. Like they were introducing their newest guest to an old friend they just found after a lifetime of searching. "What are you?" James whispered. The being didn't answer. It couldn't, not in any way James could understand. But it lowered its head slightly, settling back into its rest, and the 3 dragon hatchlings repositioned themselves, tucking themselves more firmly against the creature's chest. James looked around the chamber more carefully now, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. He saw the cryopods along the walls, dozens of them all deactivated. He saw the monitoring equipment still blinking weakly, still running on backup power after all these years. And he saw something that made his heart stop. A nameplate, etched in characters he didn't recognize, but with a date underneath it. A date that made no sense. Millions of years old. This being had been here since before humans even discovered fire. His mind raced through the implications. The dragons were engineered creatures. Everyone knew that. The Valorians had created them, refined them over thousands of years, turned them into weapons. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if the dragons themselves were engineered from something older? Something that had walked the galaxy when Earth was still cooling from its formation? The hatchlings began to glow softly, their scales emitting a faint light that seemed to calm the ancient being. They weren't resting on this creature because they'd been programmed to. They were resting because they recognized it. Because somehow, buried deep in their genetic code, they remembered. James heard voices from above, Torres and her team making their way into the warehouse. In a few moments they would be here. They would see this. Everything would change. He took one last look at the dragon hatchlings, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, cradled against the chest of something that should have been dead for eons. They were home. Somehow, impossibly, they had found their way home. And nothing would ever be the same again. The moment stretched like taffy. James stood frozen in the chamber, watching the ancient being's eyes begin to open. It happened slowly, almost painfully, like a process that required immense effort. The gold irises dilated, focusing on James first, then on the 3 dragon hatchlings that stirred against its chest. Captain Torres appeared in the doorway behind James, her weapon raised. But she didn't fire. She couldn't. The sheer presence of the creature seemed to paralyze everyone who laid eyes on it. The being's breath changed. It became deeper, more deliberate. And the dragon hatchlings responded immediately. They lifted their heads and made sounds that James had never heard them produce before. These weren't the aggressive hisses or territorial screams of typical dragons. These were something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like singing. Like grief and joy mixed together in frequencies that seemed to vibrate through the very air of the chamber. The ancient creature's massive head lifted slightly, its eyes moving across the 3 young dragons with an intensity that was almost heartbreaking to witness. In that moment, James understood. This wasn't an awakening of a predator. This was an awakening of recognition. Of reunion. "Don't move," Torres whispered behind him, her voice barely audible. But James didn't need to be told. He was already moving, not toward the creature but toward the workstations scattered around the chamber. If they were going to understand what was happening here, they needed data. They needed facts. The computer terminals were ancient, their interfaces designed for beings with more than 2 hands. But the data was still there, stored in crystalline matrices that had preserved information through decades of dormancy. James began pulling files, his fingers working quickly across haptic displays that flickered to life under his touch. What he found made his throat tighten. Genetic sequences. Thousands of them. Comparative analysis between the ancient creature's DNA and the dragons that the Valorians had been breeding for millennia. The data was incomplete, huge sections had been corrupted or deliberately erased, but what remained was undeniable. The Valorians hadn't created dragons from scratch. They'd taken genetic samples from this being's species, broken them down, modified them, diluted them, and reconstructed them into the creatures they'd been using as weapons. "Captain," James called out, not taking his eyes off the screens. "You need to see this." Torres approached carefully, her weapon still drawn but pointed downward. She scanned the data, her military training making sense of information that would have been incomprehensible to most people. Her face went pale. "This is impossible," she said. "Look at the dates," James replied, pointing to a timestamp on one of the oldest files. "This research started millions of years ago. Before the Valerian civilization even existed. Before humans left Earth." As they spoke, something was happening in the chamber behind them. The ancient being had risen onto its front limbs, its massive body uncurling like a flower opening to the sun. The movement was slow, clearly painful, as if every joint in its body was protesting the effort. The 3 dragon hatchlings clung to its chest, their voices rising in those strange, beautiful frequencies. And then James realized what was happening. The hatchlings were singing. But not randomly. They were following a pattern. A rhythm. It was almost as if they were using their voices to strengthen the ancient being, to push whatever remained of its life force back into waking. One of the other scientists on Torres's team, a Valerian named Keeper Thorne, was running biometric scans. His eyes widened as data scrolled across his display. "Its vital signs are stabilizing," he said, disbelief dripping from every word. "That's not possible. The creature should be dead. By every biological standard, it should have ceased functioning years ago." "The dragons," James said suddenly. He turned to Torres. "They've been keeping it alive. That's why they were so restless, why they were searching. They were looking for this. For their genetic ancestor. And when they found it, they did what their instincts told them to do, they cared for it." The ancient being's eyes moved across the chamber, cataloging each person present. When its gaze landed on James, he felt something shift in his chest. Not fear. Not exactly. But a recognition of something vast and profound. This creature had seen empires rise and fall. It had watched civilizations tear themselves apart. It had been alone for so long that the very concept of time probably meant something different to it than it did to humans. Torres lowered her weapon completely. James watched her face transform, the military efficiency draining away, replaced by something more human. Understanding. Compassion. "This isn't a discovery," she said quietly. "This is a reunion." The dragon hatchlings continued their song, their voices weaving patterns through the air that seemed to make reality itself shimmer slightly. And the ancient being, slowly, very slowly, began to settle back down. But this time its rest looked peaceful. Not the desperate dormancy of a creature slowly dying, but the satisfied sleep of something that had finally found its way home. James realized that everything they'd been told was a lie. The Valorians hadn't created dragons. They'd enslaved them. They'd taken a piece of a truly ancient civilization and twisted it into a weapon. And now, somehow, 3 young dragons had found their way back to the last surviving member of their true species. The implications were staggering. The entire foundation of Valerian power, their most prized military asset, was actually a living remnant of an alien culture that had flourished when the galaxy was young. And those 3 dragon hatchlings had just rewritten the entire history of their world. The meeting took place in the highest chamber of the Valerian government, in a room where decisions that affected trillions of lives were made. James sat across from the Council of Keepers, 12 of the most powerful beings in the known galaxy, and tried not to think about how easily they could have him executed if they didn't like what he had to say. "The dragons are not property," James began, his voice steady despite the crushing weight of their attention. "They're not weapons. They're not resources to be managed or controlled. They're children. Intelligent, conscious children of a species that your civilization has been enslaving for thousands of years." The reaction was immediate. Outrage. Denial. Accusations that he was lying, that the data had been falsified, that humans couldn't possibly understand what they were claiming. But James had prepared for this. Captain Torres stood and presented the biological evidence. Keeper Thorne displayed the genetic analysis. And most importantly, they had recordings. Video of the 3 dragon hatchlings responding to the ancient being. Audio of them singing in frequencies that no weapon would ever produce. Evidence that was impossible to deny. One of the older keepers, a being whose scales had faded to silver with age, leaned forward. "If we acknowledge this truth," he said slowly, "everything changes. Our military strength, our economy, our entire civilization is built on the assumption that we control these creatures." "Then you rebuild on a better foundation," James replied. "On truth instead of lies." The debate raged for hours. Some keepers argued for containment, for keeping the discovery secret. Others wanted to study the ancient being more thoroughly, to extract more genetic material. But Torres, to her credit, stood firm. She presented her military assessment. The dragons would be far more valuable as willing allies than as enslaved weapons. They were intelligent enough to choose cooperation. Why not let them? It was an argument that finally broke through. The Valerian Empire had built itself on domination, but even they could understand practical advantage. Over the following weeks, James found himself in a role he'd never expected: diplomat. He worked with Valerian officials, with xenobiologists, with philosophers, trying to establish what rights should be granted to the dragons. It was messy and complicated. There were arguments about legislation, about compensation for thousands of years of servitude, about whether the dragons would even want to stay with the beings who had enslaved them. But through it all, James kept returning to the warehouse. To the chamber where the 3 hatchlings rested against Keeper Thel's massive chest. The ancient being, they had finally managed to communicate its name through a combination of frequency analysis and educated guessing, was growing stronger. The dragon hatchlings' care had pulled it back from the edge of extinction. But more than that, they were teaching it about this new galaxy. About how the world had changed. About what its species had become. Keeper Thel, in turn, was teaching the hatchlings their heritage. James watched through observation windows as the ancient being communicated with the young dragons, sharing knowledge that had been lost for eons. The hatchlings learned their true songs, not the aggressive territorial calls the Valorians had trained them to make, but the complex, beautiful frequencies that their species used to bond with one another. They learned history. They learned that they were part of something larger than themselves. Captain Torres was the one who filed the official report to the council. It was a simple document, really, despite its earth-shattering implications. It recommended that the dragons be recognized as sentient beings deserving of autonomy and choice. It suggested that the Valerian Empire establish a sanctuary where the dragons could live without fear of exploitation. It proposed that the ancient being, Keeper Thel, be granted status as a historical monument, a living connection to a past that most civilizations would never know. The council debated for 3 days. Then they voted. 8 in favor. 3 opposed. 1 abstaining. The motion passed. 6 months later, James stood in the observation chamber of the newly constructed sanctuary. The building had been designed by a combination of Valerian engineers and researchers who had studied dragon behavior. It was massive, open, filled with spaces where the dragons could fly or rest or simply exist without constraint. Climate control maintained the precise temperature and humidity that the ancient being needed. The walls were transparent, allowing visitors to watch without disturbing the inhabitants. And there, exactly as they had been in that abandoned warehouse, were the 3 dragon hatchlings. They rested against Keeper Thel's chest, their breathing synchronized with the ancient being's own. Their scales glowed softly in the filtered light, colors that no weapon would ever need to be, colors that spoke only of peace and contentment. Captain Torres stood beside James watching the same scene. She looked different now. Less military somehow. Less certain of her place in a hierarchy that was slowly crumbling. "Do you think they're happy?" she asked. James considered the question carefully. The dragons were sleeping deeply, their bodies completely relaxed. There was no tension in them anymore, no restlessness, no desperate searching. Their purpose was clear. They had found what they'd been looking for all along. "Yeah," James said finally. "I think they are." He thought about the path that had brought him here. From salvage inspector to accused thief to negotiator to ambassador. The galaxy was a strange place, full of unexpected connections. Full of beings trying to find their way home. The real power in the universe, James had learned, didn't come from weapons or wealth or military might. It came from understanding. From listening. From recognizing that sometimes the most important thing you could do was step out of the way and let others choose their own path. The three dragons slept peacefully, their young hearts finally at rest. And for the first time in their brief lives, they dreamed of nothing but peace. No fear. No searching. No yearning for something they couldn't name. Just sleep. Just peace. Just home. In the darkness of space, on a world that was learning to rebuild itself on foundations of truth, the ancient being and its children slept together. And the galaxy, despite all its chaos and complexity, seemed just a little bit more right.